Fáilte chuig Ganéil Fáiltes Fihead go Gaelamish, the YouTube channel where I talk about anything and everything to do with the Irish language. Today I want to look at something which I get asked quite a bit as like an Irish language speaker and also an Irish language teacher as well, and that is the similarities between Gaeilge or Irish, the Gaelic language spoken in Ireland, and Gaelic, the Gaelic language spoken in Scotland. So what I just wanted to do today was just have a bit of a linguistic overview, comparing things like orthography, grammar, phonology as well. See just how similar these two languages are. So, idhlig, let's go. So to start off, I suppose a common misconception about the Celtic languages is that they're somehow this very closely related family. There's not that many, obvious differences between them. That, for example, a speaker of Scottish Gaelic can easily go to somewhere like Brittany, and they can both speak in their own respective languages and have little to no issues when it comes to things like communication. However, this is not necessarily the case, as the Celtic language family, and anyone who is familiar with any of the Celtic languages will be aware of this, is split into two distinct groups. On one hand, you have the Gaelic languages, which are languages that originally developed from Old Irish or Old Gaelic and also originated on the island of Ireland itself and were brought to places like the Isle of Man and to Scotland through trade and commerce. And the languages in the Gaelic group are Irish, Gaelic, and Manx. However, another group of Celtic languages developed on the island of Britain here, and these are known as the Brittonic languages, and they include languages such as Cornish, Breton, Welsh, and also the extinct Cumbric language as well. Another interesting fact as well is that the Gaelic languages tend to be a lot more close to each other than the Brittonic languages are to each other. All the Gaelic languages developed from Middle Irish, which was spoken up until around the year like 1200. So there's really only about 800 years of linguistic development between these three languages, which may seem like a lot of time, but linguistically speaking, it's actually quite short, considering that the Celtic language is well over 2,000 years old. The Brittonic languages are also a bit more distinct from each other than the other language groups. Cornish and Breton tend to be a lot more similar to each other than they are to, say, Welsh, for example. This is because whereas there's only about 800 years of development between the three Gaelic languages, there's well over 1,000 years of linguistic separation between the three Brittonic languages. And on top of that, they're also split into two subgroups, Southwestern and Western as well, which adds to this distinction. So, another thing to point out as well, if we are to compare these two Gaelic languages, just as an example, is that historically, all the Gaelic languages existed on a spectrum, also known as a dialect continuum. That meaning that as you go from the south here in Ireland up to the north and into Scotland, the dialects would from one town to another, one village to another, would differ slightly. We can see this, for example, if we compare a lot of the dialects of Scotland with a lot of the dialects spoken in the north of Ireland, for example. For example, in Standard Irish, we tend to say "Cunasatato" to say "How are you?" Whereas in Scottish, they say "Kimera. This is very similar to Gaeilge which is used in Ulster Irish as well. And there are certain structures, for example, the use of cha or chan, which is the negative particle, which is traditionally used in Ulster Irish, but is also present as well in Manx and, of course, Gaelic as well. So, one of the most obvious similarities between these two languages is the similarities in vocabulary. Some words you'll notice they'll be almost identical between both languages. For example, cat and cat for the word for a cat in both languages. Fiol and bo for meat and a cow. You'll notice as well with the spelling that Irish tends to use an acute accent or a fada, whereas Gaelic tends to use a grave accent, which is known as the strach in Gaelic. A way to remember which is which is, I heard someone say before that the fada used in Ireland points to Scotland, where the strach points from Scotland to Ireland. Sometimes as well, pronunciation is the key difference, similar to other closely related languages such as, say, Spanish and Portuguese, for example. EA, which is a common combination of vowels in both Irish and Gaelic, is pronounced A in Irish, but E in Gaelic. So whereas the word for man and hen in Irish would be far and cearc, it would be fair and cearc in Gaelic. Another example is the AO combination, which is pronounced E or A, depending on the dialect in Irish, but U in Scotland. For example, sir and meal in Ireland become sur and mul in Scotland. We also see this as well with the UI, which is pronounced I in Irish, but U in Gaelic. So for example, duine becomes duine in Scotland. Other times as well, words will be pronounced the exact same, but written differently. For example, the combination E fada A is very common in Irish, but is written as EU in Gaelic. So even though the word for 100 in both languages is céad, you'll see that they're spelled slightly differently with CE fada AD and CEUD, I should say. Another example of this as well is the use of SC in Irish, which is just written as SG in Gaelic. If we compare skull, skull, scian and skian, scale and scale. Same with, for example, ACHT in Irish being written as ACHD in Gaelic. However, it is pronounced ach in Gaelic, so that D becomes like a C sound. If we compare, for example, the two areas where Irish and Gaelic are spoken respectively, the Gaeltacht versus the Gaeltach in both countries. Would be less obvious cognates, for example, ty in Scotland and teach in Irish. Note that Thai does resemble Tig, which is used in Kerry Irish, for example, which is a dialect right in the south of the country. Another example being Feichkin and Fekyal as well for seeing in both languages. Obviously having like a very similar root, but have diverged slightly over time. Sometimes as well, two words for the same thing might exist in both languages, but one language may prefer the use of one word over another. For example, face, horse, and dog in Scotland are uden, ech, and cu, which are all words that exist in Irish. However, we prefer the words ai, capel, madra for face, horse, and dog, which are also words that exist in Scotland as well, but aren't as commonly used. I should also point out that ech and ku, we do have the words ach and ku in Irish. However, these tend to be a bit more literary as well, so you see them a lot in things like mythology and that kind of thing. Scottish, obviously due to proximity as well, has more Norse and English influence as well. So whereas in Scotland, you will find words like fridge, system, and computer, Irish has created new words for these. For example, Crisneor, chorus, and rivera, for example. With regards to Norse influence, this obviously comes from the Vikings. It's why in northern dialects of Scotland, you'll hear words like nabi instead of coirsnach for a neighbour, which has a cognate with the Irish word corsa, which means the same thing as well. An interesting one as well is the verb ránsaich, which means to research in Scotland. However, in Irish, we don't actually have a verb to research something. We say to make research, taidze, as well. Ránsaich was also borrowed into English as well, and it's where we get the word ransack as well, which if you know the history of the Vikings, you can see why that word would be used. Some words also have diverged meanings as well. For example, dialov or gelov in Scotland. In Ireland, it means a statue, whereas in Scotland, it means a photo. So obviously referring to different kind of art forms and stuff. Brian and Brian between the two languages. In Ireland, it means an argument, whereas in Scotland, it just means speaking as well. Some words as well, they do have slightly different connotations. For example, bodoch are both quite pejorative words in both countries. Whereas in Scotland, it's kind of just to refer to kind of like an old man or something like that. In Ireland, it has a bit more of a stronger connotation, meaning like the dumbass and aegis, jackass, any of those kind of words. So, a couple of other things to note before we start to look at like the grammar a bit more in depth and stuff is that Scottish has maintained a TV register. So this is a very common feature across like European languages. If you studied any languages such as maybe Russian or French, for example, you'll note that the U, the singular U, is used to just address one person informally in Gaelic, whereas Shiv is used to address one person formally or to address multiple people. So there's a formal informal register in Gaelic that has been lost in Irish, for example. In Irish, it's a lot more straightforward. Tu is singular and shiv is plural. There's no formal informal register. And yeah. If we compare a couple of like basic phrases between the languages, we can see, for example, the English influence on Scottish here, how hello is the general word for hello, whereas in Irish we have diolch, literally like God to you or God for you. But note that you can translate these two phrases using cognates between the two languages. Hello, which is, somewhat used in Ireland as well. If you wanted to translate diolch literally into Gaelic, you would get diolch, which you wouldn't hear a Scottish person saying that, but you can see the similarities in the vocabulary between the two languages. To ask someone what their name is, in Scotland you would say Jane Tenamahort, whereas in Ireland you say Cadas Anamdate. We do have a phrase very similar to the Scottish one in Ireland, Cén Tanamatort, which means the exact same thing, and is also a word-for-word translation as well, and it's very widely used. And it literally means like which name is on you. You notice as well, and this is kind of an interesting tidbit as well, is that the word for which in both languages is formed by adding a question word with the definite article. So Jane comes from J un, literally what the or what is the. Whereas in Irish it comes from the word K, meaning who, so K un, who the. You'll notice this a lot in Scottish in comparison to Irish, is that a lot of question words in Scottish are kind of based off of combinations of different words from like Old Irish. So for example, cadé means what is it in Irish. This became cadé and eventually J in modern Scottish. Cadémar means what is it like in Irish, which gave us Gajimmer, and Kimmer for how in Scotland. You may also hear Gadeon or Gajeon, so what is the, and this gave us the word Jane that we just saw here, which means which. So you'll notice that quite a bit in Scottish. For Cadas Anamdate, we can also translate it directly, word for word, in using Scottish word, Jes Animarut. But once again, this is not a phrase that would be used in Scotland. To say I am well, thank you very much, we can say Hami Guma Tahpilet or Tom Guma Guramagat in Irish. Um, in Irish, you'll notice that the verbs tend to contract a lot more, so we tend to use tom a lot more than tommy, although tommy is used in many dialects as well. And this long phrase that we have in Irish for thank you, guramagat, literally meaning may you have goodness, is used in some southern dialects of Scottish as well. So you might hear people say guramagat, for example. Tahpilet literally means you were clever with it, for example, in Irish. Whereas in Scotland, this would just be the generic word for thank you. Sometimes people even use like the English word thank, more than thank vor, and that kind of thing. A bhfuil Gaelic agat, do you speak Gaelic, can be translated directly into Irish, on Gaeilge agat, or have you been to Scotland, oroi an an albe, rod to an albin. Note that the aunen has been contracted to in modern Irish. And if you wanted to ask someone, just a simple sentence, where is the station? Catchville station, or Cawwell station. You'll notice again that Catchville for where is or where are has been adapted from the Irish phrase cén áit a bhfuil. So literally, which place is, or in which place is. And you notice again, this is a common feature between both languages. The Gaelic sentence has just kind of changed the spelling of the English word station, whereas in Irish we have put our own spin on the word and we say station instead of station. Another area where Gaelic and Irish can be quite different from each other is in terms of grammar. If we look at some different examples here, Scottish Gaelic has 4 distinct cases, whereas Irish only has 3. Gaelic having the nominative, dative, genitive, and vocative case, whereas Irish only has the nominative, genitive, and vocative, at least in the standard language. This is why in Scottish, in the, I suppose, the more formal written variety, we get variants such as idhlig Vic, dun idhlig Vic, Gaeilge Bice, and Gaeilge Vic. Whereas in Irish, all we have is an Chailín Beag, an Chailín Vic, and a Chailín Vic. The dative case is mostly defunct in modern Irish, however it does exist for some words, notably the word for Ireland itself, which has a distinct prepositional / dative form as well, inéireann in Ireland. Another kind of key difference between Gaelic and Irish in this respect is that Irish grammar, mainly due to like the history of, it being an official language of a state, whereas Gaelic has had a bit more of a grassroots movement in terms of standardization and that kind of thing. And what this has led to is that Irish grammar tends to be just a bit more standardized. There's a bit more of prescriptivism as well in Irish language circles, whereas Gaelic tends to be a bit more lenient with certain grammatical mistakes. Not that they're mistakes, seeing as these are things that are said as well by like native speakers as well. An example of this is the fact that there's one singular definite article on in Irish, which even though it may change in speech, particularly in kind of quickly spoken Irish, they will always remain the same in writing. So we have un, phone, un, van, un, teach, whereas Gaelic prefers to spell these phonetically, am phone, a ven, un tei. This also means that Gaelic is more lenient with, as I was saying, these kind of prescriptivist grammar mistakes, such as dropping the case system, which is very common in spoken Gaelic. Whereas a diana anobit would be considered grammatically incorrect, at least in that kind of formal written Irish. A diana haibda being preferred and being the form used in the official standard. A Jane of an Abed is almost completely fine in Gaelic in most cases. as opposed to using the genitive case, na hobrach. If you are unfamiliar with this structure here, it's that after a verbal noun, so if we're saying that we're doing something in either Gaelic or Irish, generally speaking, we have to use the genitive case as well. So literally at doing of the work, for example, or at doing the work, as we would say in spoken Gaelic. Another area as well where Irish and Gaelic grammar tend to be quite different from each other is in regards to the verb conjugation. Verb conjugation, generally speaking, has been drastically simplified in Gaelic, such as the loss of the present conjugation. This is also a feature of Manx as well, where the present conjugation was just morphed into a future tense. There's few contracted forms, as we'll see in just a second. And also the passive voice as well, which anyone who's familiar with Irish will know that we have a conjugated form of the passive. This is mostly lost in spoken Gaelic. So whereas we get things like sminium, sminium to, sminium wits, and even like in certain dialects such as in Kerry, sminir, or sminir, I should say, and sminid. In Gaelic, this has just been simplified to hami smuniachig, or tam smina in Irish. Both languages, however, have retained the habitual and non-habitual present distinction. Irish has maintained a habitual form of the verb to be. So we have tom and beam, which are both present tenses of the verb to be, one being habitual and one being non-habitual, I should say, and one being habitual. Tom is mina, meaning I'm thinking, and beam is mina, meaning I usually think, for example. Whereas in Gaelic, they just use the future tense of the verb to be. So beam smuniachig can actually mean I usually think, I think, or I will be thinking as well. We can see this in action if we take conjugation of a regular verb, for example, cut. You'll notice the past tense between both languages have remained pretty much the same. Just that Gaelic has maintained the Old Irish do, which is found also in the Kerry dialect of Irish as well. So whereas Irish will say chortu agus ní chor, in Gaelic they'll say an de churu, chad chur, mi, u, e, etc. You'll also notice in the standard language there's a contracted form for we or us in the past, and also in dialect there's contracted forms as well for the I, they form, and also for other forms as well, although they are mostly archaic. We can see here between Gaelic and Irish this drastic simplification of the present tense. So Tom agus bíma cur, along with the conjugate form of the present tense, curran, curran tú, curran sé, curran sí, curramids, curran shib, curran shiads, or even currids in certain dialects, has all been simplified into hami cur, or hami cur, I should say, and agus bími cur, depending on whether it's the action is happening now or happens habitually. The future tense has stayed mostly intact. However, Gaelic has actually maintained a relative future. So if you want to say things like that I will put or that he will put, etc. This is something that's been taken out of standard Irish, but is still common in particularly in the Connemara dialect, and also parts of Ulster as well. And also the question form is very different. You always use the root of the verb when you're asking a question or stating a negative in Gaelic. So whereas in Irish we'll have an gurtha agus ní churtha, we'll have an cur agus cha chur. You probably noticed as well up until this point that the second mutation, which is found in Irish, is not actually present in Gaelic at all. There's only one type of mutation, although slight elements of that do exist in certain dialects, and also in the Ulster dialect as well. There's many situations where we tend to use the lenition instead of the eclipsis as well. Another area where Gaelic has also simplified its conjugation is with regards to the habitual past and also the conditional. So in written Irish we have churthan, churtha, churtoch, etc. and chun churta churach for the conditional and the past habitual respectively. Although the past habitual is becoming less common, I suppose like in everyday speech in Irish. These have all been simplified into one tense just put together, which is considered conditional and past habitual, similar to how we sometimes use would to express habits in the past in English. So I would put and I used to put would just be churing in Gaelic, whereas it would be churhin and churing in Irish. Shini. So that's just a kind of like a summary here. And the last little section I just put up here was I just translated a news article that I found on BBC Alba. And I won't read out the whole text or anything like that. But if you want to pause the video here to read the Gaelic text here, the Irish text here, and also the English translation below. I just found it on BBC Alba, which is a well-known newspaper in Gaelic as well. There are a couple of things that are quite interesting between the languages. So even though like certain structures and patterns might be different, there are many words that are familiar, at least for Irish speakers. For example, the use of the word idhlig to mean a problem, whereas in Irish we prefer the word fibe more so. It's still recognizable as the word tribloads. However, tribloads in Irish means trouble. Other words which may be a little bit difficult to translate as well is tra iran, so early years, whereas in Ireland we would generally say nínri, for example. The main reason this might be a little bit difficult for speakers of either language to understand is that the education systems between the UK and Ireland are quite different in many ways. Possibly maybe for like an Ulster speaker, for someone who's from Northern Ireland, they might understand it a bit better. Yeah, and a couple like, for example, like the preference of using like certain English words in Gaelic, such as parent and for parents, whereas tishmahori would be the standard Irish words. And some words will be quite different. For example, drug and umaging or imri and borha in Irish and Gaelic respectively. So yeah, that's it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed. I am going to be setting up some maybe social media, maybe like a Patreon or something, just so I can kind of keep this channel like up and running. Also, if you do have any questions regarding like Irish in general, or even any questions referring to Gaelic or any of the other Celtic languages, just feel free to leave a comment below. And other than that, gura míle magadh as for a good féachana. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Gura míle magadh agus slán fóil.